The Monsters That Made Us is brought to you by the Cage Club Podcast Network. For all things movies, music, media, monsters, and more, head on over to cageclub.me. That's cageclub.me. Today we venture back to the arid deserts of Egypt in the year 1921. A British archaeological expedition has unearthed a sarcophagus containing the 3,700-year-old mummy of Imhotep, a high priest of the Temple of the Sun at Karnak, who was evidently buried alive for committing sacrilege. Perhaps he was a bit too gay with one of the Vestal virgins. Found with him is the Scroll of Thoth, an ancient scroll believed to bring life to the dead. However, both the mummy and the scroll have mysteriously vanished, and one of the archaeologists has been found raving mad. Have these relics been stolen? Maybe there really is something to this Scroll of Thoth. Only the enigmatic Ardith Bey may know for sure. Grab your pith helmet and pack plenty of water, because it's time to head to Cairo in search of the mummy.
To a new world of gods and monsters.
Listen to them, children of the night.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
You're crazy to know who I am, aren't you? I'll show you who I am and what I am!
You're insane. I tell you, I killed a wolf, a plain, ordinary wolf.
By studying these and other species, we add to our knowledge of how life evolved, how it adapted itself to this world.
He went for a little walk. He could have seen his face.
Welcome to The Monsters That Made Us, the podcast where we celebrate the spooktacular characters and films in the Universal Studios classic monster series. Today we're talking about Universal's 1932 production of The Mummy, starring Karloff the Uncanny as the titular mummy, and directed by cinematographer extraordinaire Karl Fruend. I'm the invisible Dan Colón, and joining me, as always, is my co-host and chief excavator, Monster Mike Manzi. How's it going, Mike?
I'm doing good. I'm ready to get down into the dirt and dig up some fun about the mummy.
I don't know about you, Mike, but in terms of overall popularity, I find The Mummy to be one of the least popular of all the Universal monsters. Maybe it has something to do with Boris Karloff spending more time in a fez than his mummy wrappings, or maybe it has more to do with the fact that the sequels abandon Imhotep altogether in favor of the silent, shambling Karis, played by Tom Tyler and more famously Lon Chaney Jr. It definitely wasn't very well received by critics upon its release, but whatever the case may be, this film has certainly become one of the most iconic in the Universal Monsters canon, due in large part to Jack Pierce's incredible makeup, and in my opinion, it might be the best mummy movie ever made. It allowed Karl Fruend to improve upon the spooky atmosphere and beautiful high-contrast cinematography that he contributed to Dracula, and it really showcases Karloff's ability to play a ruthless, articulate, and somewhat sympathetic and romantic villain. Now, do you remember your first experience with Imhotep specifically, or mummies in general?
Yeah, I have to admit, for me, the mummy is definitely one that I've seen the least, and I was trying to think back, when did we first sort of recognize the imagery or the iconography of something like the mummy? And it's weird, even to today, when I think of a monster wrapped in gauze, I think of the Invisible Man first for some reason. The poor mummy, man. I'm sorry, dude. I kind of think most people are familiar with the Brendan Fraser movies.
Right.
If you ask them about the mummy, ironically, there's a character on his new show Doom Patrol that is also wrapped in gauze called Negative Man. The imagery is alive and well and still works, but it's weird, this movie, The Mummy, when I think about it, it kind of gets lost in the mix. Thinking back to when I first, saw someone wrapped in bandages going after somebody else, honestly, I think this time I can answer it was Scooby-Doo. There was never a Munster's uncle or aunt mummy or anything like that. They were on those old Abbott and Costello movies, but I think I had probably, seen a Scooby-Doo or two before that. So even for me, I would say I'm very unfamiliar with this version of The Mummy. I've only seen this movie about 3 times now, scattered over the course of 25 years. I have not seen this in a really long time. I was very excited to get to know this version a lot better, the original version.
Yeah, I've covered this a couple times already, but I'll just to reiterate, The Mummy was one of the 2 VHS tapes I had when I was a kid, the other being Frankenstein. This one didn't play so well to me as a kid. I mean, looking back on it now as an adult in his 30s, I can see why this one really didn't speak to me as a child. It doesn't have a whole lot to offer kids, right? It's more drama and romance than it is anything else. I mean, I saw it a couple times as a kid. Some part of me knew that this was an iconic film, but it really didn't stick with me until I revisited it as an adult. I've gone to bat for The Mummy quite a few times in my adult life. I do think that it's maybe one of the best mummy movies ever made, but it took me a long time to get there, just because when I thought mummies, you think kind of that Scooby-Doo mummy, or you think basically what Karis was, which was just this sort of shambling silent mummy that had more in common with voodoo zombies than mummies, in terms of how he was portrayed, just sort of shuffling into a room and kidnapping a beautiful woman and always being commanded by some other outside force. So I've really developed a love for this movie in particular over time. But as a kid, what held my attention mummy-wise had to have been the R.L. Stine Goosebumps book, The Curse of the Mummy's Tomb.
Yeah.
Still one of my favorites. I recently read that a couple years ago while I was on vacation. And, it's like a lot of the Goosebumps books, it holds up, at least nostalgia-wise. And of course, as you mentioned, the 1999 Mummy with Brendan Fraser. When that movie came out, I didn't even realize that that was based on the Universal Studios Mummy. It took me quite a few years to really put the pieces together. And there's an Ardith Bey, and this mummy is Imhotep. And I've discovered this week that this is the first time Imhotep has been used as a character since this 1932 mummy. Like every other mummy movie or remake, and anything that is sort of based on the Universal property, they use the mummy Karis. Even Hammer Films, when they remade the mummy, their mummy is Karis. Imhotep had a long hibernation period from 1932 to 1999. To its credit, I think the 1999 Mummy, as much of it is an adventure film, I think it's still a lot of fun. And I think it does pay homage to its namesake in a pretty great way, while, also making a very, very different kind of movie.
Absolutely. A couple of things that you touched on there. I certainly agree that this one doesn't seem to be necessarily fashioned to sort of the younger audience. This one seems to be going more for, I always feel like I'm being insulting, but the more sort of literate crowd, like the ones who were reading the newspaper, who knew about the archaeological excavations that were going on at the time of King Tut's tomb and all this stuff. So it was sort of like, oh, if you went to museums and all this kind of stuff, you would be interested in this one. I also feel like they really toned down the comedy. They also toned down a lot of the warped sets. They let the Egyptian imagery sort of carry that weight very well. There's still a lot of amazing large cast shadows going on in here, and some just precise and immaculate filmmaking. But I agree on that level. I think as a child or as a little kid, I'd be like, where's the action? There's really no adventure here. I was watching it thinking, this has sort of got little hints and flavors of what will become Indiana Jones, and certainly the Brendan Fraser remake takes that to that level, where it's we got everything we have here, plus all the action. We can now do these big chase scenes and these big extravagant battles with lots and lots of mummies and stuff. And I am also of the school of, who's Ardith Bey? Who's this Imhotep guy kind of thing. Growing up, I was I had no idea the mummy had a name, the backstory they developed here. But I think this is a really great twist and would be very unexpected for anyone going back nowadays to watch this and be like, hold on a second, what's going on here? He's almost got more of a Dracula flavor happening in this movie, which I'm sure we're going to discuss at some point. And I really like that idea that the mummy was revived from a curse, and he's a guy now walking around doing stuff, trying to accomplish a goal. And that's a very interesting thing, that he's out of the bandages almost immediately and not even being called Mummy. He's got several aliases that he's going to be going by in this. So overall, rewatching it this time, it was almost like watching it again for the first time, and I was pretty riveted.
Yeah, same. Like I said, I've seen this a handful of times as an adult, and even with this viewing, now I've watched this movie a couple of times in the past week in preparation, and I was still catching details that I don't think I ever caught before. Part part of it could be that this script is more dialogue heavy, very much like Dracula was, character driven. And it's not really about, big set pieces with special effects and big grand dramatic moments. It's very much in that Dracula vein where the movie is happening within the dialogue, right? You have to really pay attention to those conversations. And I think it can be easy to lose focus when everything is crammed into the dialogue, especially in a monster movie, right? But I really like this sort of more grounded approach. Now, we had talked about how Dracula was more grounded, and we had talked about how Phantom very much seemed like a grounded film, and Frankenstein is sort of the outlier so far in that it really leaned into German expressionism in the way that these others didn't. So now that I'm watching them in order, I did get a little bit of whiplash coming from Frankenstein into The Mummy. I'm like, oh, okay, we're not just in the real world, but we're in present day. This movie came out in 1932, so the majority of this film is set in 1932. But of course, it makes up for that a little bit in placing it in an exotic setting. People in the United States would think of Egypt and Cairo as this very exotic setting. Even though it's set in modern day and it's very grounded, it is set in a very cool, interesting, mysterious place, which I really liked.
I'm thrilled that so far there hasn't been one of these set in the United States of America. They're all out of the country, and it just gives it that vibe. Like, even to today, when I watch a foreign horror movie, I feel like they're more real and visceral.
I think that it's easier to suspend your disbelief a little bit when you're not familiar with the environment.
Yeah. Totally.
If this movie were set in the United States, it'd be a little difficult to imagine it happening down the street, whereas most people in this country have never been to Cairo. So you have a little bit of freedom there to kind of make up whatever you want and say, this is the sort of stuff that could happen, I think that was 100% intentional.
I love that about it. I love that there's no mistaking that this is this is a modern movie. Like, this isn't, this is shot almost like I thought maybe Cary Grant was going to walk through this picture at some point. Like, it gets to the point, it's like super classy. It becomes like very romantic. I do think, we got some pre-code skin showing here. Like, this is for adults and titillating at the time. And I love that we're switched up. Like, it couldn't be sort of the furthest thing from the style and look of Frankenstein, yet it fits within the same world. Like, I could still believe that Edward Van Sloan is Van Helsing, even though he's not. But I'm just saying, like, if he introduced himself that way, I'd be like, oh yeah, this is the same bloke that like took down that vampire, 2 movies ago. It doesn't matter. Like, they all still feel connected on that level.
For sure. So let's dive right in. In 1922, King Tutankhamun's tomb was discovered, and that was huge news all around the world. And Carl Laemmle Jr. heard about this news and was inspired to make something kind of in that vein. So he commissioned story editor Richard Schayer, who I mentioned in our previous episode. He was one of the people who contributed to the story for Frankenstein. He was commissioned to find a novel, find a story, a play, something that kind of was Egyptian themed and could capitalize on the discovery of King Tut's tomb. And when he came back empty-handed, he was instead partnered up with author Nina Wilcox Putnam, who was pretty well known at the time, and the two of them developed this story based on someone named Alessandro Cagliostro, who was a real person. He was a self-proclaimed magician who had been alive for like decades or centuries. Of course, it was all a bunch of bullshit. He's a con artist, but this personality sort of inspired this story. And so they put together a 9-page treatment called Cagliostro. It was set in San Francisco, and it was about a 3,000-year-old magician who had survived over the years by injecting himself with nitrates.
There's versions of this movie out there, like silent film version, one from the 40s. So like this story, it got made. So I wasn't sure if this was going to be some sort of remake to that, or if this was leftover from Paramount's attempt to make their version.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know a Cagliostro movie had been made. But so Carl Laemmle Jr. was really excited about this project, and he knew immediately that he was going to have his brand new star, his new Lon Chaney. Boris Karloff was going to star. He passed that 9-page treatment off to John L. Balderston, whose name has come up in every episode, I think, so far since Dracula. I don't think he was involved in Phantom, right? So he's been sort of Universal's guy ever since Dracula. So anyway, John Balderston took that treatment, and then he actually had some experience as a journalism. He worked for the New York World, and he had covered King Tut's tomb back in 1922. So he was really knowledgeable skeptical about this sort of stuff, right? And then he took the treatment, moved the story to Egypt, changed the title character to Imhotep, and then changed a different plot point. Now, in the 9-page treatment, Cagliostro was a character who, like, his whole deal was exacting revenge on the woman who had spurned him centuries ago, right? And so he was in modern day murdering women who resembled his old lover, which I think is kind of interesting. I really enjoy what John Balderston did with this. He changed that to Imhotep trying to revive his old love by finding a modern woman, killing her, and then reincarnating his love.
Yeah, so I recognized this part of the movie very well and was quite surprised. I mean, I sort of remembered it from the Brendan Fraser version as well, that they did this too when it started happening, but I was like, isn't this Dracula? Now, I think I said, like, I never read the novel, so I came to find out it's not a plot thread from that, but it is sort of adapted later and integrated into further versions of Dracula, especially the Francis Ford Coppola version. Dracula is looking for Mina, his long-lost reincarnated love. The goal is for them to live as king and queen vampire. It got me very much more sort of engaged and interested in what was going on, not only in the movie, but in the background and the history of the production.
Yeah, I was thinking about that myself. I think, as I mentioned in the Dracula episode, I also have not read the original Dracula novel. I've read like pieces of it, but I'm not intimately familiar with it. I have seen productions of Dracula that make use of this love through the ages kind of theme. In my research, I discovered John Balderston, in writing his script for The Mummy, let me just say he wrote about 7 drafts of this story over the course of the summer of 1932. And in the process of doing that, he very clearly drew from his Dracula script quite a bit, but he also stole from himself a little bit. His play Berkeley Square also features themes of love through the ages. So this script is kind of a little bit Dracula, a little bit of his own work, and a little bit of like real life. If you were to break this film down into its basic beats and basic themes, so much of it is from Dracula. Now, I'm going to try not to constantly compare The Mummy to Dracula throughout this whole episode. It's going to become very obvious. I'll try to keep it to a minimum. Also, by design, he did basically lift almost the entire plot from Dracula for this film.
Hey, I mean, that worked really well, and they painted over it very successfully, I will say. Personally, I think they did a good job.
If I'm going to take points off of The Mummy for anything, it's kind of going to be because of that. I wish the story had been a little more original and not so much a clear copy of Dracula in so many ways. But like you said, they did successfully sort of repackage it in a way that I'm not really thinking about Dracula so much throughout the film. I mean, I am, because I do this podcast and I'm sort of watching these movies with such a critical eye that I can't help but notice. But when I'm watching these for pleasure, I tend not to think about that so much.
Yeah, and this one is also sort of growing and expanding on a lot of the actual sort of filmmaking. Like, this camera never stops moving. And, he was really testing those waters with Dracula when he was shooting that movie. Things we were saying sort of about the expressionism and how kept to the shadows, like, specifically, not this sort of mise-en-scene, like everything is very otherwise normal looking. It's all about the lighting. It's cool in that way. Like, I think that was smart. Otherwise, they might not have been able to focus and sort of push forward all their other techniques and stuff.
Yeah, I definitely find that Karl Fruend grows as a filmmaker with this. I mentioned Karl Fruend. This was his first film as director, his first feature film as a director. I think he had really impressed Universal with his work on Dracula. When it came time to do this film, I guess on some level, he was a clear choice to direct. Because, I mean, this film really does play to his strengths in how natural he shoots everything. He has a really great way of taking these stories that are set in like a realistic modern setting and making them seem hyper-realistic.
Yeah, I was just looking up his filmography, and the only other thing I've seen him of his is, I think, Mad Love, which will come a little later. It's sort of a version of The Hands of Orlac. And in that, it is Peter Lorre plays a character that still haunts my nightmares, specifically because of how he's shot. That comes all from him, from Karl Freund and everything, and it's just like the master of his craft, like doing his thing and everything like that. So
I think it's interesting that Karl Freund didn't really direct very much. He was a cinematographer for quite a long time before he got this gig. He directed 8 films. He quit in 1935 after Mad Love and decided that I guess he just wanted to go back to cinematography. That's where his true love was.
What you're sort of saying about letting the imagery work for itself, I guess, is something I was trying to maybe mention earlier as well, is that he just lets the Egyptian stuff be there. Like, he's not even really using it too much to any great degree. It's just kind of like working on its own because of how fascinating it is, right? And it doesn't feel like at times you're watching stuff and it's like appropriation or anything like that. Like it feels like in good taste and in all in good fun kind of thing, and like that these people are really interested in this subject matter, and they were making horror movies at the time, and it just fit really well. This story of an ancient civilization, it just feels like it was, destined to kind of be part of the Universal canon. I attribute that to him as a director, not trying to really play up too much of that stuff. That really hit me this time around too, where I was trying to focus in on like, what is he doing? What's he bringing to this? And I was just surprised that, that all of that sort of imagery worked really well on its own.
We should note that even though Karl Fruend was, for the most part, he was a cinematographer, he directed this, and this film did have its own cinematographer. Charles Stummer was the cinematographer on The Mummy, and one has to wonder how you work as a cinematographer under Karl Fruend. Like, I don't know if the unions were a thing yet, because today, even if Karl Fruend was directing a film, he would not be allowed to touch that camera because of unions, right? So I don't know exactly how much work Charles Stummer did himself.
That makes me think of Barry Sonnenfeld, right? Like he used to be the Coen Brothers cinematographer, and then he went on to be a very successful director in his own right. And it's like he must have had like a list of like, here's what you're allowed to do with the cameraman, because I can't touch it. It must drive a director crazy.
Here's another thing I learned, speaking of Karl Fruend and the cinematography, and with John L. Balderston. So there's a little bit of debate over just how much Karl Fruend did as director on this film. If you look at John Balderston's final screenplay, his shooting script for The Mummy, just about everything that you see on screen in terms of like how the camera moves and like the action that happens on screen is in that screenplay. It almost seems as though Karl Fruend could have just shot that movie as it was written and called it a day. But I think that would give short shrift to Karl Fruend a bit. We understand his experience as a cinematographer. He certainly would have known how to make this film. And also John Balderston, this was his first screenplay. So how would he have been that experienced to put all that stuff into the script? So the prevailing theory, there was about a month in pre-production towards the end where Karl Fruend didn't have another project that he was working on. So the theory is that Karl Fruend collaborated with John Balderston to further develop that script in like in that remaining month before production started properly. But, we have no way of knowing if that's the case or not. All we know is, what's been written down. We know the script was pretty much all written out, and we know Karl Fruend directed. I like to believe that that's what happened, is that Karl Fruend had a hand in the script writing process and was uncredited for that at the end of the film.
Interesting. I mean, because, I've taken a few screenwriting classes in my time, and generally you're told not to write camera movement and screen direction so much like that kind of thing. I mean, you could obviously write the guy sits down in a chair, but you usually don't write and then the camera pushes in on him, like you
Correct.
can, but you're taught kind of not to. So him being sort of an amateur at the time, I almost wonder if these were like in there because he didn't know he wasn't supposed to put those things in or not. One way or the other, it still takes talent to bring it to life. Not every director would have been able to transcribe what was on that page. I'm sure in the same way, like not every artist can draw what Alan Moore wrote down as a script, like it's just, you need kind of like, you need like the mastery of the creative to sort of to combine their strengths in that way.
Or another first with The Mummy is that it's the first film, at least in the sound era of Universal's monster films, that has a full score.
Yeah.
And that's also thanks to Karl Fruend, who insisted on having a full score, even though much of this movie plays to silence, much in the way Dracula did, and it definitely that silence is used to great effect in the sequences in which it's employed. But yeah, it has a full score composed by James Dietrich, which I thought was really great. Now, they still use that overture from Swan Lake in the very opening.
The same one from Dracula, right?
Right. And I also realized Universal used that in Murders in the Rue Morgue as well. So they were getting a lot of mileage out of that piece from Swan Lake.
Yeah, because Universal, they're not just making monster movies right now. They're also making horror movies as well. They're doing other stuff sort of like in line with what we're doing too, except they just don't star Frankenstein, the Wolfman, and so on. It's also was great to hear on the first commentary track soundtrack I listened to, which is a very cool conversation, very interesting guys who know their shit. Some of the other music was even lifted from other silent films and stuff, and I recognized that during the flashback sequences and everything. So that was really cool as well. Yeah, after you watch this, at least check out that first commentary track. It was really good.
So let's get into the cast a little bit. So of course we've got Boris Karloff as Ardith Bey, as Imhotep, as the mummy in the first, 10, 15 minutes of this film. I mean, he's working his ass off. Let's talk about that makeup in that first 10, 15 minutes. He sat for Jack Pierce for 8 hours to get his entire body in makeup. He's fully wrapped. Now, keep that in mind, right? I was watching this last night and I timed it. The amount of time Boris Karloff himself is on camera in that first scene is no more than 40 seconds.
So it's almost like he only needed to put it on once.
You can see Imhotep in the background of that sequence quite a bit. And now, for much of it, it was a dummy that they had wrapped, and, it's not Karloff. But for those close-ups, for the famous close-up of, the eyes opening, and then the tilt down to his arms, that's all Karloff. I'm pretty sure that the hand that we see enter the frame and take the scroll of Thoth, pretty sure that's Karloff's hand. So if that is not Karloff, then you can cut down my 40 seconds to about 35 seconds. So I read somewhere that Carl Laemmle Jr. and Karl Fruend very much disagreed over how this sequence should be shot. Carl Laemmle really wanted to feature the mummy in this sequence. Like, he wanted to see a lot of Karloff. I mean, Karloff spent 8 hours under Jack Pierce having the cotton and the collodion and all that shit just stuck to his face.
It was going to be the poster too, I'm sure. So it's like, this is what they're coming for, And before I knew that we weren't going to see this makeup again, I was like, this is brilliant. Like, this is one of the best teases. We're definitely going to see this mummy in his final form at some point, but this opening of like teasing around it and everything was great. But he never comes back like that, so I kind of got, it was a bummer.
I kind of love Karl Freund's restraint in this scene. Like, imagine the restraint it took to not show that mummy.
Oh, yeah. It would be like as if the shark worked for Jaws and Spielberg still decided to shoot it the way he shot it, right? Like,
exactly.
He has the working shark and he's not even showing it.
Yeah, I think this scene, as much as Carl Laemmle would have preferred this scene to feature that mummy more, I really love the way Karl Freund shot it and cut it. It plays better because of it. If we were to have seen that mummy more, it wouldn't have the same effect, exactly like you said with Jaws. Less is more in this case, 100%. And as disappointed as I was as a kid that this is all the mummy we get in a movie called The Mummy, as an adult, I am very happy that...
Dude, as an adult, I feel like this is one of like the greatest, what you would probably now call greatest trolls in film history, right? Where it's like, come for the mummy, but then you get like just this really old guy for the rest of the time. Part of it maybe was they knew that they couldn't really keep him in that makeup the entire movie. Like, even as they were writing it, I almost get the sense that they're like, we can't put Karloff through like this. Like, I mean, he's still gonna have very impressive makeup that I'm sure took a very long time to apply, but it's noticeably him, and I think that was a smarter move to make. And I think the movie just grabs you when it takes this crazy left turn 10 years later, and this guy is the mummy, but he's not the mummy anymore. Like, what is, like, it really is like, what is going on? It sort of becomes like a very interesting mystery.
Yes, for sure. Let's go down the cast list a little more. We've got Zita Johann as Helen Grosvenor. She was a Hungarian-born actress who came to the United States and was huge on Broadway. At the time she had been cast, she was a megastar on Broadway and was just sort of starting to get work in movies. She had only made a handful of movies before The Mummy, I believe, and really only made a handful after. She was really not into the whole Hollywood scene.
That's unfortunate because she is electric. Dan, just the reference last episode, I feel like she's kind of a Betty Davis. Like, she's got those Betty Davis eyes. She sort of has the same sort of type of features. She almost looks like she walked off of an Archie comic, like that Dan DeCarlo drew her or something like
yes.
that. Like, she's just got these perfectly inked features, and she's amazing in this. She has basically, she's the second lead, she's the only female in the entire movie, and she carries it like crazy. I think she's awesome.
And one thing I learned about her is that she was really into the occult and reincarnation
Oh, sweet.
and all of that in real life. So it was a little bit of fiction meeting reality there, right? So yeah, she was really into this stuff anyway. And you're right, she is electric in this film. It's hard to imagine anybody else playing Helen. Although, again, in my research, I discovered that the other person who had been considered, or at least was suggested by John Balderston to play Helen, was Katharine Hepburn.
Oh, interesting.
I don't know that Katharine Hepburn was ever seriously considered, but her name was thrown out there. Who's to say what this movie could have been like with Katharine Hepburn? I will say this, with respect to Zita Johann just has this sort of ethnic quality to her. Like, she looks like she belongs in this movie in a way that Katharine Hepburn may not have.
Definitely, like, with those exaggerated features. She's got a very distinct look that I think works perfectly. Now, look, also, I feel like what this role kind of requires is a bit of sex appeal, and she's got it from top to bottom as well. Like, she kind of glides through this movie like a serpent, to kind of keep with the Egyptian sort of imagery and things like that, and owns the role really well.
Yeah, 100%. And I don't know if you've heard anything about this, but I've heard many stories about Zita Johann clashing with Karl Fruend on set. Are you aware of this?
No, I did not pick this up.
There are many stories told second and third hand, so who knows how much truth there is to them. But according to sources, with Karl Fruend directing his first film, I mean, this came straight from Zita Johann, is that he was looking for a scapegoat should this movie not work out. He wanted someone to pin it on, were The Mummy to be a failure. So in production, he really kind of pinned all this stuff on Zita Johann and tried to make her out to be very difficult to work with. There's a couple stories. One that for sure happened is when they were shooting Princess Anck-Sunamun's multiple lives throughout the centuries, there was a scene where she was to play like a Christian martyr in ancient Rome who was going to be sacrificed to lions. And he protected the entire crew, he protected himself, he protected pretty much everybody, but he had Zita Johann go out onto this set with real lions, and by that point she was like so exhausted that she just didn't give a shit anymore. She's like, fine, fuck it, I'll do it. And the lions didn't really care about her. I think she said something about how like she just didn't seem very appealing because of how exhausted she was. The lions could sense that. So there's that, but also there was a sequence supposedly where he was going to make her do this scene topless, and without skipping a beat, as if she knew what he was doing. She said that if he could get it past the censors, she'd be happy to do it naked. She called his bluff. He knew he couldn't get it past the censors, and then they moved on. She sort of became the whipping boy, or, in this case, maybe the whipping woman for Karl Fruend. I don't know entirely how much truth there is to how much of a taskmaster Karl Fruend was for her, or if he was legitimately trying to make a scapegoat of her. But supposedly they really just did not get along on set, which just reading about it sounds completely exhausting.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. I mean, I always hear just about how actors are cattle, especially back then, and what they did to poor Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney as kids and stuff to keep them going, right? And all these things. So him coming from the like German school of filmmaking to begin with, where he's probably just yelling at people all day long to do shit, right? Like, and his method is just like, I speak, you listen, do, I say kind of stuff, is where I'm sort of feeling like he might be coming from at this point, trying to explain himself not only to like an American actor, but like yet alone a woman, yet alone one who's supposed to be like the star of this movie. Like, I could imagine he was having an inferiority problem on set or something if it came to that. I have not heard about any of this. Is all news to me, but it's nice to know that she tried to handle it like a consummate professional while he was just a big old baby.
Yeah, that is like the one constant, is that, should all these stories be true, is that Zita Johann, she was a professional actress, and, she dealt with it as professionally as possible.
I mean, not to bring it back, but I am watching Doom Patrol at the moment, and there's a character on there, Rita, who is a movie star from like the 40s and stuff, and what like her backstory and the kind of casting couch type of shit that she had to go through, like I could only imagine what really happened, right? Like, that's a whole other side of the story. But yeah, that's very unfortunate. Got a great performance though. She used it, I'll tell you that much.
100%. And she's another one who her career was short-lived. in terms of movies in Hollywood. She made 7 films in the 1930s from 1931 to 1934. She did have a small role in 1986 in a film called Raiders of the Living Dead. I have no idea what that is.
I mean, it sounds like a Mummy ripoff that they got her to sort of star cameo in. Like, we got the girl from the original Mummy in our fourth-rate, not even Roger Corman version.
And by all accounts, she was as much of a theatrical diva as you could expect her to be until the day she died. So I love hearing that. Like, she was one of those big, larger-than-life, almost Norma Desmond types, you know?
Excellent. I can't wait till we get to Invisible Man, because there's an actress in that who shows up in the movie Titanic.
That's right. Yeah, I realized as I was doing this research that a lot of these actors were still alive when I was a kid. You know, a lot of them made it to the early to mid 90s. I would have zero idea who they were. You know, I would have had certainly no appreciation for who they were. But it's cool to know that, like, I was on this planet at the same time as Zita Johann, at least for a little bit.
Yeah, I often think about that when I was like, oh, my dad was alive when Elvis walked the earth.
Yep. Continuing down the cast list, we've got David Manners, who we remember from Dracula as John Harker.
I didn't remember him at all because he comes across with a completely different energy from what I can tell. I was just calling him Dr. Handsome. Also, like, I just didn't recognize him, and I thought he played the part really well too.
That's interesting, because I found David Manners to be really great in, like, maybe the first half of The Mummy or so. But then once he meets Helen, he kind of falls right back into that John Harker mold, kind of loses all of the things that I found interesting about Frank Wemple.
Yeah, I kind of just had to attribute that to sort of a story where, like you say, they're kind of cribbing off of Dracula to begin with. We got the same actor. He needs to fall in love, if he's not already in love, we need to get it across that he's sort of into her, extremely, like, devoted to her even. He does kind of drop out a bit. It becomes more about her and Ardith.
I think it's just unfortunate for David Manners because he was also in Dracula, right? If this had been a different actor, I wouldn't maybe have that same criticism, but because it's the same actor playing both John Harker and Frank Wemple and kind of becoming almost that useless man in love with the doomed woman, you know, he's playing the same role. And I wish they had given Frank a little more to do in the second half of this film.
Yeah, I hear you, because you'd like to see him get revenge for the death of his father, for the kidnapping of his girlfriend. Right,
that's the thing, is it's not like he doesn't have a reason to go after Imhotep, right? Like, he should be incensed after the death of his father. Like, now it's personal. And yet all he can think about is being in love with Helen and being with her and hoping that she survives this so they can get married and have kids.
Yeah, it's hard too, because it's also kind of great how she is able to just overcome what's happening to her and win the day on her own, basically, right? Like, she takes control at the end of the movie and is able to defeat the mummy by herself. So if there was some kind of thing where they did it together, I don't know, but I hear what you're saying. He could have been explored a bit more. Especially since, again, Dan, we're here for how long? An hour and 15 minutes? Let's get an extra 5 minutes of it with Frank and see what else is happening. Let's see him, like, gear up Rambo style, grab a whip like Indy. I don't know.
Just something, yeah. We got his dad, Arthur Byron, as Sir Joseph Wemple, who I really like in this film. He's almost the Van Helsing, except we do have Edward Van Sloan in here. He's Dr. Muller, but he's basically Van Helsing.
Yeah.
Even more so than he was in Frankenstein. Now, we've talked about how he's basically playing Van Helsing in all 3 of these movies, but at least in Frankenstein, he is killed in that. He doesn't have all the answers. He's really just kind of skeptical. But in The Mummy, he's back to being kind of the know-it-all guy who believes in the occult, and he gives credence to it. And even though everybody else, the other intellectuals in the room, kind of laugh off his ideas, he's very convinced that these things are possible. So now he's back to basically being Van Helsing. I think he's great here. I don't know specifically what his relationship is with Helen, although they state that she's his patient, but, you know, we don't really know what Dr. Muller is a doctor of. He's not a doctor of archaeology, per se, but he seems to have a great knowledge of Egypt and Egyptology, you know, so I just love that Edward Van Sloan is back in the saddle as our Dr. Hero.
Absolutely, like he's the all-star so far. Like he is my favorite as well. I really love the cadence of his voice. I was trying to work an impression of him out earlier, but I couldn't nail it down, so I'm not going to do it. But like he's just got this very relaxed, distinct way of speaking. Dr. Muller, yes, he's very Van Helsing. Again, like 3 for 3. As soon as they in the opening scene when he's like, "If we open this box, there's a chance that mummy can come to life. I say we bury this box as deep as possible and forget where we put it so that we never have to deal with any of this." And then even later, he's like, "All right, this guy's very sketchy. We have to find out what he's up to. Here's all of my amulets, trinkets, and things going on." And like, it's so cool though, because I feel like modern day characters that do that are so clunky. Like there's just such a grace in his performance all the time, and he's just able to deliver like this kind of nonsense, and it sounds so academic. There might have been trying to go for a bit of like a Sigmund Freud thing. I don't want to say he's like a psychoanalyst or anything, but that's sort of a thing I was getting from him and Zita Johann, their relationship together, like why she was his patient and all that kind of stuff. And then just quickly, the stuff with Sir Joseph, right? So Sir Joseph is Frank's father, and they're this father-son archaeological duo. I couldn't help but think of Henry and Henry Jr., Indiana and his dad. Like, this predates that by quite a while, but one had to think, like, George Lucas saw this movie. This is definitely something in his wheelhouse. So who knows if that's a little bit that was cribbed down the line as well.
Yeah, the more I think about the comparisons between, this mummy and the Indiana Jones films, we've got, like you said, father-son archaeologist. We've got mystical trinkets and tombs that their magic is real. These archaeologists, these men of science, have to navigate a world of magic and mysticism. Yeah, I think the more you think about those comparisons, the more legitimate they seem. I never even really thought about how Indiana Jones could have drawn from this movie specifically. Once you mentioned that, I think you sent me a DM. Comparing them, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I think you're 100% spot on with that.
It just jumped out at me, and it again made the experience like more engrossing, right? To feel like, oh, there's a bit more importance to the sort of history of this material. You know what I'm saying? Like it echoes even deeper than I imagined.
Right. To address Edward Van Sloan, I was going to say that, like, I feel so safe anytime he is on screen. By this point, we're 3 movies in. Is there anybody who doesn't trust Edward Van Sloan, audience-wise? I mean, I have to imagine that audiences went to see The Mummy and were, like, screaming at the screen, like, listen to him. He knows what he's talking about. This is the 3rd time. Just listen to the man and we'll all go home. And, of course, no one does, and it becomes a whole thing. But I do love every time he's on screen because, like I said, I feel instantly safer. Like somebody who knows what's going on is there and is going to stop the evil from getting me.
It's so funny, like in the next 20 years, it looks like he'll make almost like 100 damn movies, like in Hollywood and stuff. I would love to go through a bunch of these, like a fistful of them, and see if he's constantly playing that type of guy. Like the guy you could always be like, oh, thank God this guy's in the movie. I could get behind this guy and know everything's going to be okay in the end kind of thing. Like, did he get typecast for the rest of his career?
I really don't love to see actors get typecast. Like when it happens these days, it makes me a little bit sad, But I really can't envision him as anybody but Van Helsing.
One thing I learned from the commentary track is that he will play Van Helsing again, right? In one of these Universal movies. So that's awesome.
We are not done with Edward Van Sloan as Van Helsing, that is for sure. Seeing him play these characters, right? So he plays Van Helsing twice, but then he also kind of plays Van Helsing-esque characters. So far, we've seen him 2 other times. Like, I have to imagine that was sort of the inspiration for making Van Helsing kind of the hub for Universal Monsters, like when they made the movie Van Helsing. And then I haven't watched the show. There's that show where they made Van Helsing a woman. I haven't watched that at all, so I don't know how they incorporate the other characters.
Yeah, I think that she's supposed to be a descendant of the original. But I'm not positive, but yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, I've seen the commercial.
At least for the Hugh Jackman movie. I have to imagine that Edward Van Sloan being this guy who shows up in Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, that had to have inspired somebody to be like, you know what if he's just this monster hunter and all these characters are in the same universe and we're just going to make him the hero? That would make absolute sense to me. I'm going to look that up and maybe there's something on it.
Yeah, I hope we get to actually explore that movie more in depth one day. But I will say I agree with that sort of thesis or that hypothesis that you put forth there. It makes total sense to me, considering that that movie wants to be within the canon of these old Universal movies universe, Like it's
Right.
trying to say it's almost like a side sequel to everything that's going on here. And then even when you get into the end of the story of the Hugh Jackman Van Helsing, like there's a sort of older, deeper connection between him and Dracula, So like that's even kind of something we wish was more hinted at in the original movie too. So these guys, I feel like, were thinking on the same wavelength that I think like we're tapping into now.
We've got Bramwell Fletcher as Ralph Norton, who has a very small role. He is most famous for the laughing, crazy archaeologist who witnesses the mummy at the beginning of this film.
So one thing I wanted to say about the Bromwell Fletcher, first of all, we used that line in the opening to the show. It gives me chills every single time when he starts laughing and he says, "You should have seen his face." I can't take it. Like, it's just something so demented. And then I was like, you know what? This guy is like, they couldn't get Dwight Fry for a day. Like, he's totally doing Dwight Fry as Renfield. But I just feel the connection more now to Dracula and all that kind of stuff, and I like it more. I think it's cool how they're just like, not unabashedly, but they're like, we own that. That's ours, so we should be able to crib ourselves if we want to. It's like it's a formula. Like, let's see if we can apply it to another aesthetic, and it did work.
The last actor I want to make a point to highlight him is Noble Johnson, who plays the Nubian servant in this. Now, to watch this film in 2021, this character is a bit problematic in that he's literally just a African slave. But I do want to mention Noble Johnson for being an African-American actor at the time, who is great in this with what little he's given to work with. But, many film lovers would also know him as the leader of the tribe in King Kong. And then he was also in The Most Dangerous Game. He was like an African-American actor at the time who, he wasn't getting great roles, but he was a working actor at the time, and I think that by itself is really cool.
It's interesting too, I guess, because they still had to sort of darken him up for the screen. I know some of that darkening was going on at the time, even if you were a black actor.
Right.
It's crazy that King Kong is next year for these film goers. Like,
Yep.
they're starting to lose their mind at the movie theater already with these monsters. And then King Kong, like, come on, dude. Like, I watch that movie now and it blows my mind. Like, I would have been traumatized, as an adult watching that in 1933. But
this movie, it does have its problems with, I think, more than a couple white actors playing black servants, if I'm not mistaken. But I do like that this movie gave Noble Johnson an opportunity.
one thing that, like, I thought was really interesting about Karloff, because he's playing, for all intent and purposes, someone from Egypt, right? And he's a
Right.
British guy, but his father is British and Indian, and that he was actually sort of more dark-skinned in real life than people are aware, so that it wasn't that far off.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I did know that. It was living somewhere in the back of my mind, and I completely forgot to mention that. So, yeah, even Boris Karloff, we think of as being an English actor, was half Indian. So
When you think of, like, Alec Guinness is in Lawrence of Arabia, right? And I think of Alec Guinness and I'm like, well, there's, like, one of the whitest British guys, like, that ever
Yes.
walked the earth, And so, like, it plays a little better knowing that about Karloff for me, as opposed to just be like, well, this movie isn't as problematic. Like, yes, we have Noble Johnson, but, like, at least on the other end, like, our lead is sort of more appropriate.
Right. Let's get into the plot of this, unless you had anything you wanted to add about the cast.
Not about the cast, but I just had a quick question about the story inception. Did you hear anything about the sort of influences of Arthur Conan Doyle? There's something about lot number 249, which was eventually made into an episode of Tales from the Dark Side. It's from like the late 1800s, and it's about, a guy gets a box and it contains a mummy and it comes to life and it starts like chasing and killing people. At least that's what happens in the version I saw in Tales from the Dark Side. I think there was also a short story called The Ring of Thoth.
The Ring of Thoth, yeah.
Yeah, that was also used as well. So, like, I just thought that was great because I know Arthur Conan Doyle,
Yeah, there's no official confirmation that either of those stories had any direct influence on The Mummy, but people have suggested that because of how similar some of them are.
But not as much as like Cagliostro's influence, which seems to be the strongest.
Right, that's where the whole thing started, so that is reasonably the most obvious influence when you watch this finished film. But yeah, there are certainly elements in Arthur Conan Doyle that could have been drawn in addition to everything else. So yeah, I did read something about that, so I'm glad you mentioned that as well. Okay, so The Mummy begins with a really great title card. I didn't expect to be talking about a title sequence, because typically they're just sort of standard, but this one uses a little miniature, which I thought was really neat.
That was great. It's almost like this fake 3D. Like, it made me think of CGI right out of the gate because of the way the camera and everything sort of twists and turns. Like, it must be on some weird turntable. Something's going on with that. It looks awesome. It's so cool.
Yeah, most of the title cards have been pretty standard for the time, but yeah, I really enjoy how this one does it a little bit differently. I mean, it's not that big a deal. It's just a fun aesthetic choice that I really appreciate. I'm always a big fan of miniatures anytime they get employed in films, as opposed to CGI these days. If someone's using miniatures, I really get into that.
Did you not get like a Viewmaster sort of like vibe off of it almost? Like because I feel like what it was trying to really go for was 3D.
Yeah.
So like I thought that was really effective. So
yeah, especially the way the camera like whips around from the side.
Yeah.
So then we get a little bit of kind of a precursor as to what the Scroll of Thoth is. Instead of like a quote or something else that's ominous, they decide to go with a little bit of an explanation of the Scroll of Thoth, which reads, "This is the Scroll of Thoth. Herein are set down the magic words by which Isis raised Osiris from the dead. O Amun-Ra, O gods of gods, death is but the doorway to a new life. We live today. We shall live again. In many forms we shall return. O mighty one."
I live, I die, I live again. Witness me, Fury Road.
So yeah, I think that was a smart move to put that right at the top. It lets the audience know exactly what they need to know to appreciate this film, because it is different from what's come before it, in that it has a foreign magic that we might not be familiar with. It's not totally easy to explain necessarily. So what we understand right off the bat, there's a Scroll of Thoth that was used by Isis to raise Osiris from the dead, and it's got magic abilities to restore life. Then we go to a 1921 field expedition. It's a British archaeology dig out in the middle of the desert of Egypt. We know already that they have found this mummy. It is Imhotep. He is the high priest of the Temple of the Sun at Karnak. Based on what they can tell from his sarcophagus, he had died pretty unpleasantly. There was some kind of struggle. And they've also noticed that none of his organs were removed, which suggests that he was buried alive. And that some of the markings on the inside of the sarcophagus, which would help usher him into the afterlife, have been scraped away to suggest that he would die again in the afterlife as well, which, that's some heavy stuff.
You are not resting in peace, basically, is what's happening with this guy, right? And to be buried alive, like, they're just painting such a gruesome picture that I'm able in my head to already, like, see what we're actually going to see later is awesome. We're going to kind of get a version of that in a flashback. But I love how this little chapter, I guess, that starts off the movie and just sets all the stakes and the pace, and we get sort of like a lot of nice exposition, and we know what our MacGuffin's going to be. It's a great little reel.
Yeah, and I love the characters in this scene. Of course, we've got Dr. Muller, the Edward Van Sloan character, but the more important characters in this scene are Sir Joseph Wemple and Ralph Norton. These are the two primary archaeologists. And now, they are both very professional, knowledgeable archaeologists. I think that the film does a really great job of establishing a respect for both characters. But what's cool about them is that one is older, has been doing this for years. One is younger and is much more impulsive and is more willing to take risks. So you've got this struggle, they have this mummy, they have a box that they have to open up, and he just kind of wants to get in there and learn as much as possible. Whereas Dr. Wemple is much more calm and studious and patient. I love that give and take in that scene.
It's a great contrast, and they're still doing this story beat to this day, where it's like, the old wise guy knows what's best, you better listen to him, and then it's the young brash dude who has to come ahead and like challenge things, and oh shit, like he unlocked hell on earth or whatever. Like he screwed up. I feel like it's great. Like it always works, but it's so clear cut here and so well done. And again, it's not like they're throwing it in your face. It's just like, oh, like you should be able to pick up on this. Like there's this trope that, the young brash go-getter and then there's the older wiser professor and stuff. And so it makes perfect sense why he would like overreach and be ambitious and all that kind of stuff.
There's a lot of information to convey in this scene, and I think they do, like, this script does a really great job of telling us a lot about these two characters while also giving us the information we need to understand what's going on. This is such an efficient scene, and I really love it. In addition to the sarcophagus that they've found, they've also gotten this box which has a warning on top of it, and the warning reads, "Death, eternal punishment for anyone who opens this casket in the name of Amun-Ra, King of the Gods." And of course, Dr. Muller rightfully is like, do not open this box, like you said, get rid of it, don't even mess with this shit. And meanwhile, both archaeologists, both Sir Joseph and Ralph Norton, both intend to open that box, right? It's just that Ralph doesn't have the patience to wait until he's told to do it.
Well, Dr. Muller basically, he goes to Sir Joseph and he's like, let me talk to you outside the tent for just a moment before you're going to open that box. Just hear me out really quickly. But he goes outside and he's like, bury it immediately. You have to get rid of everything here, leave no trace. Like, he might as well just be like, burn it all and like wipe your minds and stuff. And then while they're outside, the cat just got too curious. He just could not wait 2 minutes because he has his opportunity. Well, what would you do? You're alone. You seize the moment. So that's what he did.
Yeah, for sure. And of course, we've got this incredible sequence where Ralph opens the box, unrolls the scroll of Thoth, translates a piece of it, and then we see the mummy, Boris Karloff, in full makeup, the eyes slowly open. I don't think I've ever seen anybody open their eyes slower than Boris Karloff does in this scene. I feel like they must have slowed down the footage too, because it's just inhumanly slow.
It lingers, and it should. It's supposed to, like you said, this has sort of been, again, like I feel it's like one of those really fast-paced talking newsroom movies almost at times, because they're dropping so many words, like Isis and Amun-Ra and like Karnak and all and like I'm kind of having trouble following a little bit of that kind of stuff until I just let it, wash over me. It all kind of means the same thing. And then it's like the focus is on the fucking mummy, and it's like, they draw that shit out for a minute until he opens his eyes, Then they're going to cut away immediately. Like, we're never going to see him again. He goes bye-bye forever. For me, it was really interesting. I was, like, trying to take a moment and, like, digest all of this information, and the movie just, like, wasn't going to let me. It was like, nope, here comes the mummy. Like, this guy's going to lose his mind. It's going to be 10 years later. I'm like, what is this movie doing?
From a technical point of view, I find that scene, like, at least up until Karloff wakes up, the whole scene of Ralph opening the box and unrolling the scroll. It's a very drawn out sequence, but there's no music. I wrote a note watching that scene that the silence in the, like, there's barely any sound effects. It's just so quiet. The silence is just so oppressive that, like, I'm not stopping to think about how slowly this scene is being drawn out. It's just, my heart's in my throat. What's gonna happen? Then, of course, once the mummy wakes up, the scene just kind of stampedes toward his exit. Yeah, I love so much about this scene, from the high contrast, the deep shadows, the silence, and then Karloff slowly waking up, taking forever. And then, of course, he takes the scroll and leaves Ralph Norton, like, he breaks him, essentially. He screams, but then descends into a fit of laughter, which, as you said, is incredibly terrifying. Like, it's not like a funny laughter. That is like a really upsetting laughter. And he's so good at it.
Yeah, great actor in that part. Like, truly believed the laughter of a madman, and definitely no sanity in that, no joy or anything. I mean, just chilling.
Yeah, so that's the end of our prologue. We jump forward to 1932. The British expedition is still in Egypt 11 years later. We meet up with Sir Joseph's son Frank, who is now part of the expedition. We find out a couple things. We find out his father, Sir Joseph, is back in England while the expedition continues. And we also find out that Ralph Norton went crazy and died laughing in a straitjacket after his incident in 1921.
I love that this movie is going to have a time jump and a flashback. I was like very down with this, like 11 years later. Like, this is interesting. And then the son is sort of picking up where the dad left off in the expedition in a way. Well, we come to find out that he has a benefactor who seems a little familiar, if you ask me.
Right. So in that scene, we meet a new character, we think, Ardith Bey, who looks surprisingly like Boris Karloff. He is under less severe makeup. He's wearing a fez and is supposedly, just a citizen of Egypt. And he has been guiding this new British expedition.
They're looking for his long-lost love's tomb, right? Like her body is basically what the excavation is all about.
I don't think it's clear specifically what they're looking for. All they know is that they've been digging. They haven't found anything. Ardith Bey shows up promising them the most sensational find since that of Tutankhamun. He promises to show them where to dig to find the tomb of the Princess Ankhsenamen. I don't know that they were looking for her specifically, but that's what he's promising them.
Okay. At first I thought that when he showed up, like he was like, I've been the one sort of funding this joint. And they're like, oh, nice to meet you. But I guess that's not the case. However, it turns out to be sort of the case when he's like, oh, you guys haven't found anything. Let me show you where to dig.
Yeah, it's been 11 years and we don't really get much of an explanation as to why it's taken that long for him to finally make a move.
Yeah, I mean, it's got to have taken him a while to sort of like accumulate a bit of wealth, to sort of look a bit more normal, right? Like, I would imagine that audiences totally would have bought the concept that we're looking at a guy who's like, 200 years old or something. Like, this is probably great old man makeup for the time. I kind of dig it. Like, I buy it. Like, there's something sort of off about him, but you could also accept that maybe, he's got a disease or something. I don't know. Like, there's just like a skin problem going on with this guy. Not necessarily that he's, thousands of years old or whatever.
Right. The British expedition kind of desperate at this point. It's either they try this or they take their few findings and they go home. They decide to dig where Ardith Bey tells them to dig, and of course they find the tomb of Ankhsenamen. All of those artifacts are dug up and taken to the Cairo Museum, which there's a fun moment there between Frank and his father, because of course Sir Joseph has to come back out to Cairo to examine these new findings. There's a great moment where Frank seems disappointed that, they had done all the work to find this stuff and then the Cairo Museum gets to keep it. And of course, Sir Joseph being the pure archaeologist is, we do this for science, not for profit. So, I love that little moment there.
It belongs in the museum.
Totally.
I like the dynamic, the father and son thing going here. Like, I feel like, we've had issues, like, those have sort of been that was the problem with Frankenstein. He didn't get along with his dad, right? Like, so he tried to be a better father by making a son, I guess. But, like, it kind of goes back, even Dracula can be seen as, like, an abusive parental figure of some type. I just feel like that's a root of like psychological damage that they're trying to mine for horror movies, and even to this day. But I feel like it's nice in this to see a father and son like working together to figure this out. Back in Dracula, it was Mina and her father, but like he was too busy running the asylum to even really know what was going on.
All of Ankhsenamen's tomb, her belongings, with everything sort of now in the safety of the Cairo Museum, where Ardith Bey can easily access them. Now his plan really starts to be set into motion, right? He was able to exploit the British expedition to get all this stuff out of the earth, and now it's safely above ground where he can access it. There's a great moment here where he is viewing the sarcophagus and all of her things, and then the camera cuts from her sarcophagus to a weird side scroll of the city. It's like they just ran a piece of paper with a city on it across the camera instead of a legitimate pan.
It was almost like a Edgar Wright wipe.
Almost.
That like streams across the screen. I noticed that too. I was like, what is this, like a flash sideways or something? And it's like, sure enough, across the city, here's what's going on, right?
I don't know if you picked up on this, but that transition connects Ankhsenamen's sarcophagus to Helen Grosvenor, which is brilliant.
Genius. That must have been a storyboard, Like, that was awesome.
I love that. We as the audience don't really know what that means yet, but we as monster fans certainly know what that means. So now we get to know who Helen Grosvenor is. She is the daughter of an English governor of the Sudan, and she lives in Cairo staying with Dr. Muller. As you suggested, he may be a sort of a psychiatric doctor, and that's their relationship. But the film never really tells us explicitly what that relationship is.
You know what I want that relationship to be now, though, now that I've been thinking about it, is I want her to be the next Van Helsing. Like, she is his ward. Like, they are like Batman and Robin almost, where it's like he's teaching her everything he knows about monster hunting, and she's like in his charge, almost like a Laura Croft, almost, I don't know, kind of situation. She could be the new Van Helsing on the Sci-Fi Channel TV show.
I feel like there's a closer parallel between her and like Moon Knight, you know?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Especially all this like stuff taking place in Cairo, the multiple personalities. Yeah, this is very close to that as well, which I believe was also sort of a riff on Indiana Jones. Nice.
So now we get to know who Helen is. She's at this sort of swanky party in Cairo. She mentions, how much she kind of hates the modern Cairo and wishes to get back to like the real Egypt, the old Egypt, which is a nice bit of foreshadowing.
As soon as she's introduced, he's already, the mummy that is already kind of doing his magic, right? Like he's unrolled a scroll and started chanting in the corner of a museum somewhere, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, while she's at that party is when he really starts to revive Ankh Sanamen.
Yeah, so it's almost like this lingering precursor to her emerging personality coming forth from the past. And that was really cool too and everything. I'd almost forgotten about the concept of reincarnation altogether. And it was nice to just bring that back into the forefront of my mind again and everything. I think that's a really fascinating concept. And I think it's used here in a very interesting way. The idea of these sort of souls like throughout time locked together, almost like a cloud atlas kind of thing. I'll find you in 1,000 years.
Totally. Ardith Bey doesn't know that yet. All he's planning to do is revive the mummy of his long lost love. So as he's reading from the scroll of Thoth, she is suddenly entranced by his words. She's hypnotized and leaves that party and goes immediately to the museum where he is. And as she's banging on the door, Frank Wemple is there at the museum and notices this. Now, he doesn't know who she is yet, but when she faints, he takes her back to the care of Dr. Muller. And Ardith Bey is interrupted as he is trying to complete this ceremony. One of the museum guards appears and suddenly puts a stop to the ceremony. He blows out the oil lamp and then strangles, or, we don't see how he kills the guard. That's one thing that I find interesting about this movie is that Ardith Bey makes a point to tell Dr. Wemple that he does not like to be touched. He appears very fragile, and even Karloff himself is playing this role very still and as if he's gonna like blow away with a stiff breeze.
That's totally true. He's extremely stiff, intentionally, like all of his movements are extremely measured. It's almost like he is made of glass,
yeah.
Right? But it is like, yeah, if you touch him, he's just gonna like kind of crumble.
Yeah, we don't see what he does to the guard, but he kills him somehow in the darkness. And we find out later that another guard heard the noise or whatever and showed up, and Ardith Bey had to leave. The point being, Ardith Bey leaves behind the scroll of Thoth.
He has not finished the ritual. It's not done yet. It's sort of been interrupted.
Not only has he not completed the ceremony, but he has lost the scroll. So now we go back to Helen, who wakes up at Dr. Muller's with Frank. Of course, this is the beginning of the love affair between the two of them. Between you and me, as I sort of hinted at earlier, this is sort of the part that I'm least interested in, because I don't think David Manners is the most interesting leading man as a love interest.
It took me back to Phantom of the Opera, because if you remember in that, like, her boyfriend was not gonna stand for the Phantom taking his girl away from him or anything, and like truly fought to get her back and all this stuff. It was like super chivalrous and everything. It was almost like a musketeer at one point. It reminded me of, and we're not getting any of that with these love interests for any of these movies. Granted, I think Frankenstein's fiance was the most proactive out of all the significant others so far. But yeah, it's kind of a bummer, especially since this is something they could have remedied from Dracula, right? Like they're working on trying to like not do it again, but sort of improve upon. So this is one place where it sort of dropped the ball.
And so after the guard is discovered, the scroll of Thoth is taken to the Wemples, and Ardith Bey comes seeking that scroll. And that's when he gets to meet Helen for the first time. This is about halfway through the film when they finally meet, which I think is a really long time to put your two lead characters together.
It is, but it's also sort of gonna be the rest of the movie. Like, I think of the halfway point in most movies, right? And it's usually where things kind of like really kick into gear. You know, you're like in the middle of it, like every kind of half hour. Like, I guess an incident is supposed to propel the film forward, but this might be when they land on the asteroid or something like that in Armageddon.
I also have to remember this movie's like an hour and 10 minutes. It's not long. A half hour is not that long, really. It just, to think of this moment happening in the middle of the film seems like a long time. But yeah, you're right. It is only a half hour. So when Helen is holed up at Dr. Muller's recovering, Ardith Bay appears and seems to hypnotize Dr. Muller's servant and places him under his control, much like Dracula did. This is when he meets Helen for the first time, and in their meeting, she seems to feel familiar with. There's a moment where it's just the two of them, they're getting to know each other, and she's kind of in this trance-like state and mentions that she's never felt so alive. More hints to her previous lives.
Yes, very cool sequence, like very interesting, because we know that he's up to no good at this point. We know that something's going on with her, and he's at her house, like he's invading. Like, this is gonna be super dangerous. You know, he's taking control of the slave guy. Like, it's nuts.
And the scene that plays out just after this, it's one of the scenes that is most explicitly drawn right from Dracula. It's the scene where the monster and, for lack of a better terminology, the monster expert get to know each other. And they sort of have like this battle with words, the same way Van Helsing did with Dracula. Down to certain beats, this movie almost like it feels directly lifted from Dracula. For example, there was an exchange that I wrote down. The men, Wemple and Dr. Muller and Frank Wemple, they're all like talking, and Dr. Muller says, "We were just talking about," and Ardith Bay interrupts him by saying, "Me?" And Muller responds, "You're native Egypt." I couldn't help but think of that moment like, who could have done this? Count Dracula.
Right, at your service. Yeah, I still think it works, you know? Like, I actually did not pick up on that because I get how you did, but it didn't land nearly as well as it did in Dracula for me. But I was just excited again that they don't shy away from this sort of promo cutting kind of thing where they're like backstage at WrestleMania meeting each other, sort of like telling each other off a little bit, you know, where he's like, "You don't know who I am, like you don't even know I've been around, like I'm a 1,000-year-old mummy motherfucker." And Dr. Van Helsing's like, "Bitch, like I got this fucking ring, I know the scroll, I'm gonna burn that shit, like you're going down." It's so funny too because it's the two oldest men in the world like talking to each other and they're really just like egging each other on.
Yeah, and I love the moment where Muller is sort of, he suspects that Ardith Bay is dangerous, right? There's something going on with him. They know what the Scroll of Thoth is. They know he's after it, but they need to make sure that it's Ardith Bay, right? And Muller puts together on his own that the mummy that went missing 11 years ago, you know, was never found. You know, they had the Scroll of Thoth. Is it possible he had been resurrected? He also knows that Ankhsenamen was his lover back in the day and could be trying to resurrect her. Like, Muller has figured all of this out.
That's the one thing where Dracula had the mirror gag to reveal him. And this doesn't really have it in the scene. The scene is left without that.
Well, yes and no. This movie doesn't have the mirror, but he does present Ardith Bay with the sample of the translated Scroll of Thoth and with the photo that Ralph Norton took. And Ralph Norton in that opening scene mentions he took a photo. So now we get to see that photo, and it's the combination of that like little piece of paper and the photo where Ardith Bay has a strong reaction, like he's been made. It's not like Dracula where he, you know, knocks it to the ground, but it is the same moment where he reacts to it and Muller knows that's his guy.
Yeah, I guess I just missed it again because it's not as clean as in Dracula. Like, to me, it just is like, I'm like, oh, he's dogging him because he's got like he's got like magic items and stuff like that. And the mummy is like, shit, this guy's on to me. It ends the same way, basically. But yeah, it didn't sort of land the same way.
This film, just in general, I find to be played much more subtle than Dracula was. And so this moment doesn't have a big dramatic flair to it, but it's the same moment nonetheless. You know, Karloff is like, again, he's playing this like he's made of paper. And so he can't get real physical, but he can glare, and he gets more aggressive with his language. They basically flat out say, like, I'm coming for you.
Yeah, see you in the ring.
Right. And this movie also has a talisman, you know, so just as in Dracula with Van Helsing having the crucifix, in this, Muller has a talisman that is associated with Isis, the god of life, which is the antithesis of what Imhotep is all about.
I also like how it's accepted by everyone that this guy is supernatural, or could be. The idea that Van Helsing's theory isn't just immediately thrown out the window, that everyone's actually entertaining this concept. They're like, yeah, I've heard of supernatural stuff happening before. Like, maybe this is that. Totally. Like, let's investigate further.
He does seem to convince Sir Joseph. So when Ardith Bey takes off with his Nubian servant, Muller instructs Sir Joseph to destroy that scroll. You know, without the scroll, Ardith Bey cannot achieve his goal of bringing back the love of his life. The next day, Sir Joseph plans to do just that, but of course we learn that Ardith Bey has like a pool in his home, which allows him to spy on whoever he wants.
I love this idea, like that he has this like reflecting pool that he looks into, almost like a crystal ball, and he basically reaches out and force chokes this guy.
Yeah.
It's terrific. It's so cool.
This is another element that I've seen employed in versions of Dracula, not in the Universal Dracula, but in other versions, where Dracula has this ability to like transmit messages. He has like telekinetic powers from like across the city. I've seen versions of this sort of played in Dracula.
Do you know where I saw this? I think it reminds me of Mum Ra from Thundercats. I think had like a reflecting pool that he would spy on the Thundercats with. But, you know, his name was Mum Ra, for crying out loud. I'm sure they mined all the mummy references they could for him.
And so, yeah, he uses his ability. It's not really clear what he does. He either strangles Sir Joseph or he gives him a heart attack. But either way, he prevents him from burning the scroll. And then he sends his servant to retrieve that scroll. And then immediately brings Helen, psychically draws her to his home, where his plan is to show her the beginning of their story.
This is my favorite part of the movie. Also, okay, we had like that 10-year time jump earlier. Now we're going to get a flashback. And not just like a flashback, but like they're going to use the reflecting pool to look into the past. It's so great how like all of these filmmaking devices are like merging together. I'm having so much fun. Like, I'm so glad that he has this magic pool. I'm so glad we're going to get this flashback. I think it's great.
This flashback, I think, is really interesting just from a technical standpoint, because it looks like it was shot in a very different way from the rest of the film. It looks like Karl Fruend went back to a silent film, you know, like kind of leaned on his experience as a silent film cinematographer and shot it that way, because some of it looks undercranked. I don't know if you noticed that. Mm-hmm. And I mean, the whole thing plays without sound, so it makes sense that he would do that. Also, it's set in the past, which creatively, why not use filmmaking styles from the past so it looks, you know, like there's all kinds of things happening in this scene.
You've got very good instincts, Dan, because that was kind of confirmed on the commentary tracks. Like, that is something all the guys on the track put together as well. And not only that, but the music is from an old silent film as well. It's not part of like the new orchestration or anything like that going on. And plus, it seems to be that it was shot at like 18 frames, which was traditional for silent films. And there are those sort of jerky jump cuts at times. And plus, if you look at Karloff, he's acting in a completely different manner. I mean, albeit he's playing a totally different version of the character. But, you know, up until now, he's been standing still for the most part, giving a very commanding performance, especially with that voice of his. But here you see him like reaching and dramatically stretching and just like going over the top like you would get more often in the silent era.
Yeah, for sure. This is one of my favorite sequences in the whole film. I think I'm with you in that it's so unique and it really sticks out stylistically from everything else that comes before it.
We get those beautiful shots sort of the silhouettes and things. Like this feels more like the Frankenstein or Dracula kind of style. Like, you know, I'm glad the whole movie isn't like this, but it's great that we get a touch of it. A movie within the movie almost.
And so we get the whole backstory, sort of what we've been waiting to find out, because I think up until this point, if you're a brand new audience member, it hasn't really been explained as to why Ardith Bay is so taken with Helen. I've seen this movie so many times, it's difficult to remember what it's like to watch it again for the first time, but I think this is where that whole relationship is revealed, right? The high priest Imhotep had an improper relationship with one of the Vestal virgins of the temple of Isis. It didn't seem that there was any penalty for that by itself, although there's some guards in that scene who kind of shake their head disapprovingly as he's kneeling at her deathbed. But where he really crosses the line is when he sneaks into the temple of Osiris and steals the scroll of Thoth in order to revive her, which would have been incredibly, sacrilegious. And as he is trying to perform this ceremony over her corpse, he is interrupted by guards and other priests. Actually, his father. It was his own father who condemned him to what he called the nameless death, which was live mummification and burial in an unmarked grave. So we get the whole sequence where he is mummified alive and stuck in the sarcophagus, which is then stripped of all of its jewels and like all the fancy adornments.
Yeah, it's desecrated.
And then he's carried out to an unmarked grave. All of the slaves that were used to carry him out there were killed, and then the soldiers who killed them were also killed.
To really cover your tracks. Like, talk about...
Yeah, I've never seen so much effort put into the death of one man before in my life.
This flashback is actually pretty shocking. I mean, maybe even for pre-code era. Like, first of all, this backstory, like, the whole mummies deal is, like, super sexually salacious and taboo, okay? Which is, like, it's all about getting it on and stuff. And, like, I think the movie might also be trying to sneak in a little bit of, like, the whole, like, you have sex in horror movies, you're gonna die. Kind of thing. This maybe even this early, I don't know, but like the whole kind of like sex is bad, all that is here. I was surprised to see that. And the death of like the guards and stuff, you get like multiple shots of these long sort of spears going straight through their hearts, like right through their bodies, right? Like it's very Temple of Doom type stuff at that point. Like I was surprised how far they were able to take it. And then this movie doesn't really have that many stunts in it, but I have to give it up to Karloff for basically in that one shot they're putting the gauze all over his mouth, his nose, his eyes, his entire face. Like he is struggling there for a little while, possibly holding his breath for a bit and everything stunt wise. But like this whole thing blows my mind. They're showing a guy getting buried alive.
And that footage of Karloff, as we will discover, was reused and reused and reused again. We're going to see bits of that sequence a lot as we get through this franchise. So the memory of their former life over, we learn that Ardith Bay Imhotep believes that Helen is the reincarnated Ankhsenamen, and his wish is that she undergo a, quote, great night of terror and triumph until she is ready to face moments of horror for an eternity of love. And so essentially his plan is to kill her and mummify her and then resurrect her with the Scroll of Health. Because right now she's in a mortal body, so she needs to die first to come back.
And not only that, this fucking creeped me out. Talk about like existential crisis. Like there's a moment where he takes Helen, they're in the museum, and she's like, "What's this?" And he's like, "That's your body. That's where your body lies. It's mummified, it's dead. I can't use this one." She's like, "What are you talking about? I'm in a body already. This is me." Who wouldn't have a breakdown thinking about that, right? And so that's the deal. Like they can't use her old body because it's an actual like mummy thing. Like she was supposed to go back into her old body, but she was in this new host instead, right?
Right. And so there was something I realized about that scene. We haven't quite gotten there yet, and we will, and I'm excited to talk about that because it's not as simple as Helen just saying like, "No, I don't want to do that." It's a little more complicated. So once we get there, I'll definitely be bringing that scene up. In addition to the whole story of Imhotep being sentenced to a live burial and so on and so forth, did include a sequence of events. I mentioned it a little bit before. It was a sequence of events depicting Helen's previous incarnations. At one point, as I mentioned before, she played a Christian martyr who was fed to lions, in ancient Rome. In one life, she was a Viking woman. In another life, she was a French noblewoman. For the sake of time, all these scenes were cut out of the film, and knowing that they exist, I can't say that I think that the movie would be better for including them, because I think one of the things that's great about The Mummy is how efficient it is. And this would have been kind of more footage than is really necessary to tell the story. I get what is happening just with what's here. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'd only like to see it just because it was shot. Like, it seems crazy that there was such behind-the-scenes problem about even shooting the stuff in the first place that it's a shame that it's not even in the movie in the end of the day. This was the whole thing with the lion and stuff, right?
If you notice in the credits, at the bottom of the list of credits, an actor named Henry Victor is credited as the Saxon warrior. He's an actor who's in one of those scenes, but for whatever reason, his credit was never taken out of that list of credits. So it's like the one holdover from that whole sequence.
It's kind of funny. His name is Henry Victor, and it's like Henry and Victor from the Frankenstein movie combined. I don't know what's happening there. But you're right. Like, I get the point. We get the picture. I don't, if anything, we're talking about like fleshing out the boyfriend more and doing that kind of thing, right? I feel like we've got plenty of what's going on with the mummy and his girlfriend.
Exactly. Before Helen returns home, the dog that she had with her, a beautiful German Shepherd, has been killed. Some suggest that may have been Ardith Bay's cat. I know you love that white cat. Matter of fact, I read that John Balderston planned to have a lot more happen with that cat.
Yeah, so when the mummy is using his reflecting pool, he's got like this cat just sitting there, and it's sort of implied that it's his familiar or something. And there is sort of a moment, don't they describe that the dog was found with the cat like sitting on top of it or something? Was the dead dog found, but the cat was sort of like in the vicinity also? Yeah,
I'm not entirely sure what the specifics of that sequence were going to be, but I think it was supposed to be more apparent it was the cat that killed that dog. But clearly that dog is not happy to be there.
No, I know. Yeah, no, that is not a stage dog, whereas the cat doesn't even know what day it is. But I also feel like they just got any old cat because, like, those aren't the same cats that I see from, like, Egyptian stuff on the internet. Then they had completely different types of felines.
Possibly, yeah.
At that time in that region of the world, so I don't know if that... It just seems like we need a cat. I do like the concept, though, that like he's like this kind of warlock or something now, and he's got, his pet cat like a witch would.
In the script, the cat was to be more involved. All of those scenes with the reflecting pool, like the cat would have been like sort of more involved in those ceremonies, and they must have had trouble getting this cat, like training a cat to do the things they wanted it to do. So instead what we get is just Ardith Bay has a familiar, who just kind of hangs out in that room, which totally fine.
It is just sitting there though, like I saw it at the corner of my eye and I just started laughing. Like it kind of, then I know it wasn't supposed to, but it just took me out of the moment for a second. Now it's like one of my favorite things about the entire movie.
Before we move past the scene, I want to mention that in addition, all of Zita Johan's costumes in this movie are gorgeous. From that ball gown she wears at the party earlier in the film to the sort of more traditional ancient Egyptian garb she's wearing towards the end. But I think my favorite costume that she wears in this whole film is the one is that sort of like black number she's wearing when she's being presented with all of this history. It's like, I don't know, she got this little black hat, this like slim black dress, the gloves, and the dress itself has these really interesting, like almost keystone shaped buttons. Anyway, I love the costuming in this whole movie. And let's see, who did costuming for The Mummy? That was Vera West. I want to give her the credit because I think more than the costumes for the previous 3 films we've talked about, this one has, like, in terms of just pure fashion, this one works on so many levels for me in the ways that the others don't. Maybe it's because they're set in time periods that are much earlier, and this is very modern. In particular, I love this look.
Yeah, and I think also just due to sort of the locations lend themselves well to contrast of outfits just by, there aren't as many fez and sort of long robes in London when we get back there. It's kind of cool, like with change of geography, you get change of wardrobe as well, in the way that those clash and cross over.
Yeah, so I just wanted to highlight that before we moved on.
Oh, you know what we missed that I saw, and this is pretty cool. There's a very early rear screen projection shot in this when they're driving in a car.
Oh, yes.
it's like totally easy to miss because they just take that for granted, just assume it's always been around. But I know like that's something that Hitchcock would take and sort of run with like a little after this time or around this time too, and like, yeah, revolutionized filmmaking. And you look at it and it's processed like perfectly. Like, they don't do it any better for 100 years.
I didn't intentionally skip over that scene, but I also didn't think that there was much in it that was totally important, worth noting, aside from the rear projection. So I'm glad you brought it up. I learned that was something Karl Fruend was a real pioneer on, in addition to being a pioneer of the moving camera. That was just another contribution of Karl Fruend to American films. So we could thank him for that. Now, so there's rear projection in movies from now all the way until, the 1960s and 70s, and you're right. I don't think it gets better than this because it's so subtle. And I think, I don't want to keep overusing that word when it comes to this film, but I mean, that's really the only word I can think that's best for that particular sequence. It does look really good. I've seen far worse rear projection, that's for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, it wouldn't stop there. In the 50s, he would work with Lucy and Desi on I Love Lucy, and he pioneered like the flat lighting system and the 3-camera shooting system. He was a pioneer of that as well. So like he just kept innovating.
His 3-camera setup for sitcoms is still used today. Blows my mind. Okay, so Helen returns home, without her dog, and she's kind of in one of those weird transic states. So the men, of course, assume that maybe she's ill, not feeling too well, and they have her lay down while they plan to destroy Ardith Bay. While Helen is resting, Frank places that talisman on Helen's doorknob as a sort of protection charm. But in doing so, leaves himself vulnerable. So while he's taking a nap, Ardith Bay uses his reflecting pool much in the same way as he used to kill Sir Joseph, seeks to destroy Frank. Luckily for Frank, he wakes up and manages to crawl his way to that medallion and falls unconscious, while Helen is now sort of put into another transic state and lured back to Ardith Bay's lair.
Yeah, and when they get back there, she is in like full-on princess garb. Very extremely revealing. I mean, talk about wardrobe. Incredibly hot stuff, like even to today. That's like a dress like something J-Lo would wear.
I thought that the ball gown that she was wearing early on, like that sort of shimmery thing, I thought that was kind of revealing. It was certainly more low-cut than I'm used to seeing in these films. The only thing I've seen up to this point that would even compare is the Mina in the Spanish version of Dracula wears something that's very low cut.
Okay.
I think we talked about that on Dracula, where the Spanish production wasn't beholden to American censors, so they could get away with a little bit more. So she's, in a low cut dress. Here, Zita Johan's first dress is pretty low cut, and it's pretty form fitting too. Like, it really doesn't leave much to the imagination. So I'm surprised at how much before that final Egyptian costume they put her in got through. And then they put her in that super revealing outfit, which I think looks really good. I mean, but also, we're not living under the Hays Code anymore. So it kind of reminded me of Carrie Fisher in Return of the Jedi in like the metal bikini. Very similar to that in terms of it, being a revealing kind of sexy costume.
Certainly.
And so now we're in the final act. We're in the end game here. Ardith Bay has his princess. Helen is now pretty much fully Ankh-Sanamen. She is speaking as if she is Ankh-Sanamen. I don't think she realizes that she's in a different body. She knows who she is and is very happy to be back together with Imhotep. But what she doesn't realize is that he must kill her and embalm her to get rid of the shell of Helen, then reanimate her so that she can be immortal, in this new vessel.
Yeah, she can't live forever until she dies. It's almost another sort of Dracula thing. He's not quite undead. He's more of the living dead, I'd say, the mummy. But that wasn't part of, like, the deal, I guess. She wasn't so sure that needed to take place. Like you said, it's a little more complicated than he's letting on. And she touches him, and she kind of remembers, like, oh yeah, like, you're dead.
Right.
This isn't cool. Like, I did not sign up for that. Like, she kind of thought it was all over. Like, this is great.
Right, and so that's the one thing that I kind of picked up on this time that, like, I never really noticed before, is that she realizes as Ankh-Sanamen, if she is still this person she was 3,700 years ago, it would be unlawful for her to touch this person who was dead and raised back to life. Like, she is a Vestal version of the temple of Isis, the god of life, right? So the idea that someone could die and be raised from the dead, like necromancy, would be very sacrilegious and abhorrent. You know, he's an abomination. And so her original principles come back to bite him in the ass. She's like, no, fuck off, dude. I don't want any parts of this.
Yeah, it's like this was almost like natural magic, and he's talking about like black magic or something like that. Like, you know, these repressed memories of Helen's were going to surface one day, one way or another. And like he just kind of gave him an extra push. But like now this is going too far. This, like you said, is necromancy. Like this is dark arts type shit. Like this was outlawed even back in their day.
So now Imhotep has reached a point where, you know, I've come too far. I've done too much. I'm not going to not have you. You know, like she's going to now be his bride, kicking and screaming if that's what it comes to. So as that's all going down, Muller discovers Frank's unconscious body, revives him, and then they realize Helen is gone and she must be at the tomb in the embalming room. So they immediately rush to save her. But where this movie is a little bit different from Dracula, which I really like, they are too late. Frank and Dr. Muller don't make it in time, and they're effectively useless in the final climax of the film. And we sort of talked about this before. Helen / Ankh-Sanamen, whoever it really is, because she realizes that she's Ankh-Sanamen, but also there's somebody else in there with her too. She wants to live. So I don't know if it's Helen or if it's Ankh-Sanamen. I'm not really sure. I would like to think that Helen has more to do with this, because if she doesn't, then really all Helen is a damsel in distress. I want to believe she has a little more control over herself in this scene, but it's really not very clear.
Yeah, my main reading of it was at first that Helen is sort of breaking through and woke up, but it also could be read that Aksunama comes to the realization that, like, oh, I've lived, like, this is unnatural, like, there's someone else, it's their time. I see how that could be a reading, but I always thought it was Helen breaking through and maybe still speaking in Aksunana's voice or something, or it's not too clear, but that's the way I always took it.
It's definitely not clear, but for the sake of the character being more than just this damsel in distress, I want to believe that Helen has a little more control in this scene. But really, I think it's up to however you want to read it. It's not definitively one way or the other.
What I like is at least we don't have that moment in Dracula where Mina tries to kill Jack, right?
Yeah, I think Helen is never used for ill here, really. The only goal in this whole movie is for Imhotep to be back together with the woman he loved, right? There's no, if you just isolate that, there really aren't many people in this movie who die, and when they do die, it's because they are interfering with his overall mission. I mean, he's not Dracula in that Dracula really wanted to, you know, overtake the world, kind of. You know, he wanted to create more vampires and really take over at least England. I don't see that from Imhotep. And I like how simple that is and how collateral damage is not really a factor in this film.
Yeah, even though it's sort of the similar situation, I'm not getting the sort of creepy vibe that I was from something like Phantom or even parts of Dracula, maybe because there's no real comedy balancing any of it, that it feels so dramatic, it almost becomes melodramatic. And like, I buy the sincerity of all of this. Like I was saying earlier about how much they must have loved this new fad of, hey, they found all this stuff in the desert, like, this is amazing, let's get really into this, let's make a movie about this somehow. Like, I don't know, I think like the movie, not that it takes itself too seriously or anything, but I think it just really earns these kinds of things naturally, I guess. You know, they don't ever feel like forced upon me or anything. It just feels like sort of a natural resolution.
What I do like about this story so much, this film, is that Karloff is not playing an antagonist. He's not really playing a villain for most of this movie, you know, because his motives are pure enough. You know, I mean, he's dabbling in necromancy, which by definition is kind of a villainous act. He's doing it for pure reasons and only kills when he needs to. It's not until Ankh-Sanamen / Helen decides, no, I don't want to do this, this is wrong, that he really becomes the monster, like in the last minutes of this film. And I think that's what's cool about this monster is like the Frankenstein monster, Karloff was able to elicit a lot of sympathy for this character, you know, as sort of strange and weird as he is. Like, he didn't resurrect himself, you know, he was brought back to life by somebody else. So it's 3,700 years later. I get why he would try to be reunited with the woman he loved, right? Like, all his motive makes sense.
Yeah, right. Like, I'm actually, in a weird way, I feel for this guy. It isn't fair what happened to him, you know what I'm saying? But it's also like, you can't, like, hypnotize women to fall in love with you, which is like the other side of it. Granted, you know, that was kind of like a coincidence, okay? Like, he wasn't trying to do that. It is what happened, though. So, like, as he keeps up the facade, you don't know really until it's too late that he intends to kill her.
Yeah.
You know? Like, she doesn't know that and everything. So it all seems like this is as far as it's gonna go.
So we come to the end of this, and as we sort of mentioned, Anxanamen/Helen, whoever you want it to be, calls on this statue of Isis to save her from what is about to happen. At the same time, Frank and Muller arrive, but they are held back. Ardith Bey's magic is too powerful for them to overcome. So as Anxanamen/Helen is praying to the god of Isis, we get what I believe to be a better, more satisfying, if abrupt ending than what we got with Dracula.
Oh my god, dude. This is like the king of abrupt endings. I love this sequence though, because by the time it's over, I'm like, wait, what? What just happened? Oh my gosh. Like, I'm so sort of like satisfied and confused at the same time of what just happened.
Right. I remember, like, when we talked about the ending of Dracula, we were both kind of okay with how it ended, but we acknowledged kind of how strange it was that, you know, Dracula took Mina down into the basement knowing he was being pursued and immediately, like, went to sleep in the coffin, leaving himself vulnerable to attack. Whereas in this, they chose to end the mummy with a Deus Ex Machina, literally.
The hand of goddess this time.
Yeah, the statue of Isis comes to life and disintegrates Ardith Bey/Imhotep, and he turns to dust and falls to the ground. Helen and Frank are reunited. The Scroll of Thoth burns in the ashes of Ardith Bey. I mean, it's a Deus Ex Machina, so it is sort of a cop-out ending. But all things considered, like with everything that has happened up to this point, I really don't mind it at all. I actually really love this ending because the men are not involved at all. It's all Helen and this mystical god of life that turns out to have, like, she's real and saves the day.
Yeah, I really like the fast-paced confusion of everything that's happening at once. It is a Deus Ex Machina, but I don't feel it as heavily because there's been a lot of magic throughout the movie. If this was like suddenly a statue came to life out of nowhere, you know, and like there hasn't been any sort of mystical things before this, no wizardry has happened, then I'd be more like suspicious.
The Isis statue coming to life and disintegrating somebody is the only real visual effects shot, you know, like there's really nothing visual in terms of the magic in this film up until that moment. Everything else is sort of done through suggestion, through dialogue and editing.
And then we get the shot that I really wanted from Dracula, was seeing him decompose after getting a stake through the heart. And we get this great sort of couple of quick shots, dissolves and fades of the mummy decomposing and some sound of him falling to the ground and collapsing. And I just love it to pieces. It's so great.
Yeah, I love that these like sort of transitions to show either decomposing or evolution. You know, we'll see similar techniques used in The Wolfman, and we'll see something similar in The Invisible Man, which we're going to do next. So as primitive as it looks now in 2021, I really love that that's the technique they decided to use to convey that, as opposed to relying on more theatrical, like stage theatrical techniques where you would see, for example, with Dracula, I think I mentioned this in our Dracula episode. You would see a bat flying in the window. The bat would fly out of view, and then Dracula would enter to suggest he has transformed from a bat into Dracula. You know, so instead of using a technique like where it's off camera, I love that they keep everything in camera, even though it, you know, by modern standards, it doesn't look so good.
Yeah, but, you know, they're still doing these same tricks today. Again, you know, camera dissolves and things like that to show the passage of time, or makeup effects and things, or at least I remember a lot of that still happening when I was a little kid. It's great fun, and I think there's been a trend set by Universal Monsters and everything. Like, before The Mummy came out, from another studio was Jekyll and Hyde, which is a really great version, and in that they do sort of the same process technique of when he transforms from Jekyll to Hyde. It's like the Wolfman transformation, you know? It's just a bunch of dissolves, and they keep adding and subtracting makeup and things like that and stuff. So I almost wondered if it was like, guys, we really gotta do this effect this time. Like, we gotta show them we're on the ball, like we could do it too, and it's not just something that you have to go see another movie to get this effect in.
Right. And I think sort of what I was getting at by saying that I love that they use those just fades to transition, even though it doesn't look as good. What I meant to say by that is it's similar to like sort of how I like, practical effects these days, because so much is done with CGI and doesn't look as good, in my opinion. I prefer practical effects, practical makeup, puppets, anything that is existing for real in the environment that I'm looking at. I always prefer, even though technically it looks fake. So in the case of The Mummy, I prefer to watch Ardith Bey decompose, as primitive as the technique is, as opposed to not seeing it. I mean, we don't get to see him collapse, but I do love getting to watch the transition.
I totally agree.
Sometimes the techniques that show the seams, that show that, oh, you're watching a movie, are the ones I like more. I think that's a good place to wrap up this episode. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Mike?
I mean, I guess I'd just like to close it out by saying I'm going to be rewatching this one a lot more. This was like a nice, like, sort of rediscovery for me. I'd only seen it, like I said, like 2 or 3 times now. And I definitely want to revisit this one again in the future. It was a lot of fun. I love how the mummy powers up into Ardith Bey, becomes a warlock. Totally crazy shit like I did not ever associate with the mummy before revisiting it seriously with a fine-tooth comb for this program. I was very glad to do that. It's a stunning movie. Yeah, so I definitely feel like spread the word about the original Karloff mummy.
Yeah, I think I agree with you there. As a kid, as I said, I was expecting, a movie about a mummy, so I was expecting more mummy, and I was inherently disappointed by the lack of mummy. But as I've gotten older and gotten to appreciate more sophisticated storytelling, I find that this particular movie, of all the Universal Mummy movies at least, is the one that is most rewarding. Like I said, I'm still finding things in this movie that I've not noticed before, and I find that to be infinitely more enjoyable than a movie about just a straight up mummy shambling around in his mummy wraps, for the whole 60, 70 minutes or whatever. So this is a much more sophisticated story that I just really needed time to mature, and I needed to develop more sophisticated taste, I guess. This is not a movie for kids. And so I'm glad that I have really rediscovered and refallen in love with this, in my adult life, ever since I really started to appreciate films as an art form. Because I think this one is so underrated, at least, if not the best mummy movie. I think the reason it doesn't get watched or talked about as much is because it has this reputation. People don't talk about it, so why should I watch it? Well, I think I could speak for both of us and say, watch this damn movie. It's so much better than it has any reason to be. Even if it draws heavily from Dracula, I think in a lot of ways it improves on what Dracula was trying to do.
Yes, and I don't think the average moviegoer is going to notice any of that either if they hadn't just watched Dracula like
That's
we
true.
did or done extensive research. You're definitely right about the demographic that is going to enjoy this more, and now that I'm older, I think I can understand it better, and definitely deserves repeat viewings. And who doesn't want to see the Mummy movie where there's no mummy? That's such a hook. Be like, you haven't seen the original Mummy, dude, there's no mummy. What do you think that's about? You got to watch it to find out. It's great.
With that, I think it's time for us to shamble back down to our tombs. But don't worry, we'll return on Friday, February 26th to discuss our favorite Universal monster, the Invisible Man.
Oh, we're there already? Nice. I look forward to seeing if he's still my favorite monster by the end of the run of this series. So, looking forward to the Invisible Man.
In the meantime, you can follow us on Twitter at MonsterMadePod, on Instagram and Facebook at The Monsters That Made Us, and you can email us at themonstersthatmadeus@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Dan Colón. And Mike, where can listeners find you?
You can follow me on Twitter at @the_Mikester. You can hear all the other shows that I'm on, all the other podcasts at cageclub.me, facebook.com/cageclub, or at cageclubpod on Twitter and Instagram.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to support the show, you can become a Patreon subscriber at patreon.com/themonstersthatmadeus. You can also pick up one of our t-shirts on TeePublic, and you can find the link for that in our aforementioned Twitter and Instagram bios. For all other things Cage Club related, just head on over to cageclub.me. That's cageclub.me. And until next month, stay spooky, everybody.